Welcome to the Tesla Economist. Please hit the thumbs up and remember to subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter and talk to me on Patreon. I don't even like using the term competition anymore when describing companies in the EV field relative to Tesla, but so be it. I don't believe we have seen the true EV competition even emerge yet. Remember, EVs are still only around 2% of all vehicle sales. The sleeping giants are still mulling it over perhaps, working out the right strategy before they pounce. Let the other startups make all the critical mistakes first that they can learn from. Perhaps they're waiting for various technologies to mature or be accepted as the industry standards. Because when they finally start their EV companies, then they aren't going to mess around. They'll be all in. They aren't going to start small and slowly scale up. They'll need to create a serious vehicle to sell. What industry of giants am I referring to? Well, obviously not the antiquated legacy ICE auto industry, right? Yeah, obviously. You see, legacy autos may or may not go all in EVs. They talk a big game, saying how much they'll invest, but we aren't sure who is actually willing to lend them half of their market capitalization to invest in an industry that clearly is not in their repertoire. That is apparent now. All legacy can do now is really convince stockholders to not sell their legacy stocks through big, elaborate dog and pony shows and stunning advertising. There are simply too many legacy systems in place, creating costs in areas that no longer offer the competitive advantage they once had. The Chinese are absolutely destroying them with new startups that even have no experience manufacturing cars. Just like how Kodak invented the digital camera that killed their core business, Xerox PARC's division invented the graphical user interface that destroyed their core business, and GM started the first production EV, and now their core business is under attack. Sometimes you just aren't the right business for the job. It doesn't always fit, even if you invent the product. So who are the conglomerates that will potentially enter the market? Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with Google, Apple or Amazon. You see, as we know, the main issue for an EV company is battery supply and technology. Therefore, would it not be reasonable to assume that a company that produces batteries would therefore have an edge over an EV company? When it comes to legacy autos, the main intellectual property is the engine, how well it performs, how fuel efficient it is, whilst trying to reduce emissions, and as low cost as possible. Well, could the equivalent intellectual property for an EV be in the battery technology, how energy dense they are, what cost they can be produced, how fast they can charge, etc. We're seeing just how excruciatingly hard it is for Tesla to make their own batteries, to refine them into something that will create enormous leverage for mass production, low-cost batteries. And then, legacy companies are trying to team up with LG, SKI or Northvolt, but these auto companies don't appear to know much about batteries and aren't investing huge into R&D to come anywhere close to Tesla. But what about a company that is already experienced in making batteries? Brands that are already synonymous with things that are electric. Obviously, the two that come to mind are LG and Panasonic, although Samsung and even Sony are on brand for electric transport. But LG and Panasonic are already very good at making batteries, in fact batteries specifically for EVs that are tried and tested. The EV industry is enormous. It's going to be bigger than ICE. It's only in its infancy. We know at least how far it has to go to replace all the ICE vehicles, so it has at least 50 times larger to get just there. But then all the other associated side industries like FSD and robotaxis. But not only is it a big industry, it's incredibly profitable too, if you do it right. Especially if you go big enough to reach economies of scale. How could these companies attempt this? Well, the Chinese seem to be rushing out every model, each time making improvements on what they've learned along the way. Every new iteration somewhat better than the last, and evolving at a rapid rate as a result. But it dilutes the value of the models, and they end up having nothing all that special, compared to the very limited number of models Tesla has released over a much longer time frame. I think the battery companies would spend some serious time, effort, research and development in getting a really great car out to the public. I can even visualize what they might look like in my head. And you know what? It could look really great. And with the Panasonic or LG brand behind it, then I think that it gives some serious brand support, much more than, say, Ford. It feels like the right brand for the right product. Of course, think of all the outstanding internal electronics too. These companies make all sorts of components that can be used, even the screens. In fact, as a result, they should have no problem being heavily vertically integrated, especially given they make their own batteries already, which is the hardest part. Tesla may even let them manufacture their 4680 batteries too, but possibly not likely. If I was Tesla, I would have an ironclad contract that all 4680 batteries are exclusive to Tesla until otherwise stated. But Panasonic and LG might want to create their own equivalent of 4680 batteries anyway. These are the companies that can most justify enormous research and development in battery advances, as they can potentially benefit from them the most. Well, second most after Tesla, when compared to Ford or GM, who only aim on selling 1 million EVs by 2025, and obviously they won't achieve that. But remember, EVs are only 2% of the auto market still. There's no real hurry for them to dive in necessarily. The main reason you aim for early adoption is to secure market share before it saturates, which might be necessary for Lucid or Rivian, but for a long-established brand, then it might not be as urgent, particularly as they're already established making EV batteries. Sort of like how Microsoft managed to get into search so late in the game. They had a related brand with the operating system and Internet Explorer web browser, and all other search engines more or less died out, except for Google, and perhaps that's what will happen to all the other EVs. Maybe there won't even be any niches for them. It's possible the EV industry could be an oligopoly, just a few players in the industry. Well, similar to the legacy auto industry, really. So maybe these electronics companies will wait a little while until they announce an EV. In the meantime, they can continue to perfect their prototype. If Panasonic launched a prototype EV, then their stock price would go through the roof. What market would they go for initially? Although the world is craving a cheap compact EV, I think it far too mass scale for their first venture, without more experience. So perhaps it would be a more upmarket car first. They also need to establish their price point and position in the market with their first car, like Tesla did as a prestige brand. I would say perhaps a 50 to 60,000 SUV might be a good position first. It doesn't seem to be a market anyone has addressed, somewhere in between the Model Y and Model X. At that price, it will give them some buffer for profit margins whilst they get started. On the other hand, they may just want to compete directly with the Model Y. But I think the important thing is spending more decent time on the vehicle, making sure it is suitable for mass production. They shouldn't have too much issue exceeding a range of 300 miles either. The more I picture these cars, they just seem that much more apt to be in the EV industry than a dirty old ICE company. Besides, ICE companies are half the reason we're in this mess. Why should they get to benefit from the cure? There are a few other brands that would also fit EVs, but I think the fact they already produce the batteries is such an advantage. BYD is the only Chinese company that make their own batteries and EVs, and they do finally have a reasonable consumer vehicle, the BYD Han, but also they are licensing their technology to Toyota, and will provide the batteries, tech, motors, all of it. It's just a shame Toyota didn't also outsource the design too. The interior looks cheap, tacky and gadgety. Minimalisation is the future. It probably drives like a Toyota too, and its price will likely be around the same as the standard range Model Y. Of course, that would be the standard Toyota, likely with very few options, at least nothing comparable with what you get with a standard Tesla. However, someone on the design team must have seen a Tesla Model S Plaid, as they now think it's hip to have a yoke steering wheel too, except it's not quite the same when you're holding onto it only doing 0 to 60 in 6 seconds. But Toyota are the biggest ICE company, so it's interesting to see what they are trying to do in their desperate attempt to scramble to the future, that they so arrogantly dismissed. Oh well, serve them right. But at least they haven't been caught with any emission scandals. So this is how I see a possible future. Tesla can't make all these cars themselves, and I think electronic brands are a much better fit for the future of electronic cars. Thanks for listening. Please hit the thumbs up and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and talk to me on Patreon.